I'm going to show a technique for making drum reverb crunchy using modulation. So I have a drum pattern here that's going into a reverb. And now I'm going to insert a modulation plugin before the reverb. So it's on the send, but just before the reverb plugin. Let's have a listen just to the modulation. So at the moment is doing amplitude modulation, which means it's changing the gain of the signal at 75 Hertz, which means 75 times a second. Now when I send it to the reverb, it sounds a little bit more crunchy. This is without and with. Now, if I play with the speed or the rate of the modulation, I can get interesting sounds. Now, let's bypass the reverb for a second, just so we can hear how it goes into audio rate modulation. So this is becoming more interesting. Obviously, this works well on drums, but on pitched instruments, it could interfere with the key unless we tune it to a specific note. At the moment, the modulating waveform is a sine wave. If I switch it to a square, we'll have a more edgy shape. And through the reverb, now I can play with a mix of the modulation, so I can ease, that's completely bypassed, and I can dial it in until I get some texture. So bypass. It sounds a bit flat, and this gives it a bit of excitement. What I can also do is I can time the modulation, so I'm going to engage sync. So now it moves at 1 cycle per beat, because it's synced to the DAW. Now if I set it to do the 16th, which means 4 times per beat, and without, I'm basically reducing the information that goes into the reverb. So I'm kind of muting the hi-hat and all the sort of ambient room sound and all that. So it's very condensed. And again, without and with. So I get a distinct kind of drum sound. Now I can play with the phase. If I reverse the phase, what happens is it's actually muting the kick and the snare. Creating a smoother reverb tail because it has less transients going in. This sounds a bit more like kind of lexicon and more diffused reverbs. Let's hear it bypassed. I mean, obviously there's level differences, but so this sounds really interesting on drums. Now I'm going to use frequency modulation, and that will sound like this. And if I speed it up, so that's pure FM. Let's hear it going into the reverb and bypass. So again, this is kind of predictable, pleasant, not disturbing anyone, but this has more attitude. Obviously, I can play with the mix to just give it maybe something like that, gives it some attitude. Okay, let's put the mix back to 100%. And then I'm going to incorporate the amplitude modulation as well at the same time. So let's bring the frequency up. We get that, I mean, this could be tuned to the key of the song, which can make it interesting. But just for the sake of showing what the phase does, because at the moment, the frequency and the amplitude modulations are moving together. But if I flip the phase, or let's say 90 degrees. So now we're creating a texture where the amplitude is doing one thing, the frequency modulation are moving at the same rate, but the phase is different. So this gives more control. Now I can play with the depth of the modulation. Remember that the amplitude modulation is basically cutting some of the sound out because it's kind of reducing the level. It can't boost the level, it can only take it down. So again, the phase makes a lot of difference. Obviously there are very big level differences, but we can compensate for that. So let me bring the mix down a bit, and let's bypass for comparison. Attitude. Now I'm going to try it with a different reverb. So let's bypass. I have 3 reverbs here. This is the one that we've been using. Let's change to another one. And that's reverb number 3. And now let's engage the modulation into each one of them. So that's the H reverb without and with. Let's switch to Valhalla. Here you can really hear the modulation, and without. And back to the IR1, which is impulse-based reverb. Again, without and with. Now I can play with the pitch to get really different tones that almost resemble changing the reverb size and other parameters. Make it more punchy, more resonant, and I can play with the waveform as well. Let's try Sawtooth and bring the rate right up. We can increase the mix as well. So this is really, really fast. We can make it even faster. That could resemble like a room sound on a kick or something like that. Bring the mix right up and bring it back to square. So we can achieve so many different sounds just by changing the modulation rate, depth, and mixing between amplitude and frequency modulation. If you like this video, you know what to do, and I'll see you on the next one.